everyone. Thank you for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the greenhouse gas accounting and cost. I'm Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. I'll be providing support for this meeting. For today's agenda, we will continue discussion with Kevin Head on the workshop and open discussion questions on unspecified zonal approach. And then we will have at the end Brian Jacobson, who is the scribe for this working group, to provide a recap of the discussion. And then Kevin will go over topics for the next meeting on Tuesday from 1 to 3. We also have Phil Pendegal, who is the coordinator of the EDAM working groups, is available here to help respond for any questions if needed. And then for our reminders for this meeting is that these are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives on the topics. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time. Kevin will call on you, and once you're unmuted, please make sure you state your name and affiliation. And after, put your hand down once your question is done. These meetings are recorded, and we post the video files on the corresponding working group webpage, where you'll find all those materials related to this meeting. This recording and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And then lastly, if you do have any questions or follow up on this meeting, please submit through the inquiry link located on the resource slide at the end of the presentation. Now I'll go ahead and turn it to Kevin Head to go over the meeting objectives.
Thanks, Brenda. Welcome everybody to Working Group 3. We are talking today about the unspecified or zonal approach. And really today's going to be a conversation that's just a continuation of what we discussed on Tuesday. So we had started on this fleshing out of some of the details of 4 main areas in the unspecified or zonal approach to the greenhouse gas optimization. And so I'd like to continue that discussion today. It's a pretty simple agenda, but I think we'll cover a lot of ground. So I'm going to come over and share my screen and get started. Does anyone have any housekeeping items they'd like to discuss before we kick off? If you do, raise your hand. If not, I'll just get started. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up, so I'll just get started. So what we had discussed last time is that there were 4 main issues or areas in the unspecified or zonal approach that needed to be spelled out a little bit further. And specifically in the presentation that was given on the version 2.0 of the unspecified or zonal approach last week, there was several different options that were mentioned. And so what I'd like to do in today's meeting is get a little bit more of the working group's decision making behind those options. And you'll remember that we started with the possible source-specific pathways to the greenhouse gas zone. And this is a slide from the presentation that was given last week. And these source-specific pathways are ways that generating resources that are located outside of physically located outside of the greenhouse gas zone can directly serve the greenhouse gas zone, instead of having to rely on the hurdle rate and the price differential between the non-greenhouse gas zone and the greenhouse gas zone. So this was sort of an alternative or source-specific pathway for those resources to do that. And the first pathway was a longer-term one that was based on contractual commitments. And this would allow these external resources to be treated as if they are physically located within the greenhouse gas zone. So they would be dispatched with the carbon price applied to them, even though they're not physically located within the greenhouse gas zone. The second path is a shorter term one that seems to be based on kind of surplus supply being available to serve the greenhouse gas zone. So what we had discussed last meeting was we started to characterize what this path 1 might look like. And the first question that came to my mind, and you'll remember this document, was a set of questions and decisions that I thought needed to be made by the working group in order to have this fully fleshed out, unspecified or zonal approach going into the straw proposal. And what I had done was, of each of the four main topic areas, I had started to spell out what those questions were. And we got some really good conversations about this path one, longer term commitment to serve the greenhouse gas zone. And I had initially thought of it as us needing to prescribe the types of contracts that would be eligible to fit into this, and whether they would need to be backed by transmission, and how that would interact with RPS and clean energy standards, and how long the commitment would need to be. But the folks from in last week's, or on Tuesday's meeting, said, well, hey, I mean, the states already have these types of criteria spelled out, so why don't we just rely on their requirements? And so I think we had reached converged on a answer on that. So what I had done here is just put in a conclusion as to what the working group, I believe, what the working group had described or had concluded upon. So the first step was basically how do these resources become eligible to use Path 1? And I proposed to include this, which is, in order to be considered a Path 1 resource, there has to be a contractual arrangement that, one, obliges the generating resource to serve load in the greenhouse gas zone, and two, that that contractual arrangement has to meet the relevant state requirements to serve that load. And those requirements could include, the type of contract, the length of the contract, whether or not it's backed by transmission, and whether it would interfere with other state policies. So I don't want to rehash this topic. I think we had reached a pretty good conclusion on that. What we started to explore at the end of the meeting was, okay, now that we've deemed them to be eligible, how does this actually work in the market? How is this information used? And two approaches were raised. So the first one is what I call like a tagging-based approach, jokingly called the ask for permission approach, which would be where, in order to use this Path 1 on a day-to-day basis, the scheduling coordinator would submit an e-tag by 9 a.m. that verifies the resource's intent to deliver into the greenhouse gas zone. The ISO would then verify that e-tag, which would allow the scheduling coordinator to submit bids for those tagged megawatts, which would need to be submitted by 10 a.m. according to the normal timing of these bid requirements. The bidding window in the day-ahead market closes at 10 a.m. Then the market would take that tagged megawatts and optimize based on those submitted quantities, and ultimately wind up with a market solution for that. The second was an audit approach, audit-based approach, which I like to call the ask for forgiveness approach, just joking around. But this would leverage the existing bid adder functionality for greenhouse gas bids, but recharacterize it a little bit from resources outside of the greenhouse gas zone expressing their willingness to serve the greenhouse gas zone, but instead it would indicate the quantity of megawatts that are supported by an eligible Path 1 contract. And then the dollar per megawatt price, remember this greenhouse gas bid adder is a two-part bid adder. It's got the megawatts, the quantity, and then it's got the dollar per megawatt hours, the price. And so the price would be, if I understood the idea correctly, outside of the SC's control, and instead would just be based on the relevant greenhouse gas allowance price and the greenhouse gas emissions rate of that specific resource. Then those quantities would flow into the market as bids into the greenhouse gas zone directly. The market would optimize, do its magic, And the ISO, after the fact, could audit those transactions to ensure that they were indeed backed by a Path 1 contract. And then if there was some sort of failure of the audit, a negative penalty would be imposed. So a lot of information there, and this is meant to sort of recap what we discussed last time. We never reached a conclusion on how these might work, and I'm relatively sure that I've mischaracterized something in here. So maybe we start on this topic, and then we'll move into what the Path 2 approach might look like. So if anybody has any thoughts on which approach is better, or if there's a third option, or perhaps a refinement of one of these two, let's raise our hands and get the conversation started. Again, this is really a working group effort to try to workshop this approach to make sure that we have some specifics around it so that it can be put into the straw proposal. So I see that Jeff Spires has his hand raised. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and let us know what you're thinking?
Yes, good afternoon, Jeff Spires with PowerX. Thanks, Kevin, for the recap and the summary. I think that was helpful to kind of establish where we are and what we're evaluating here. I actually wasn't wanting to really get into the details of the two different options here. I just wanted to point out that I actually think of these approaches as a better fit under Path 2. Okay. The reason I say that is, in my mind, Path 1 is something that's longer term, and I know we haven't precisely defined that, but that under Path 1, we're talking about in advance establishing what the GHG zone is defined as, and recognizing that some resources that might be outside of the physical state boundaries may be most appropriately assumed from a modeling point of view to be part of the zone. And so a lot of what you said towards the beginning around, there's going to be some program requirements or criteria that might lead to that conclusion that a particular resource should be included in the zone. But my assumption is that once you've done that, that resource is now inside the zone, and when it goes to participate in the market from day to day, it's getting treated as such. So I think that the more detailed discussion around how could a resource on a daily basis take steps to show that it's delivering into the GHG zone through those two approaches you just described is better suited to Path 2, where we're trying to find an approach for resources that are outside of the zone to be able to make the determination that they are delivering into the zone and want to be treated as resource specific, but it may be, on some days and not others, or some hours and not others, et cetera. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think a lot of this fits better under that category.
Okay. So Kathleen Colbert I believe it was you who had proposed this audit-based approach. Is that what you had in mind, Kathleen? Maybe just raise your hand when you have a chance to think through it. But Jeff, I hear where you're coming from, and I think that it does make more sense to have it be the shorter-term Path 2 type transaction. So let me call on Kathleen just to make sure that she's agreeing on at least how I characterized it and whether she thinks it better falls into Path 2. Kathleen?
Hey, no, yeah, this is Cathleen Colbert from Vistra. I think that there is a slight disconnect between the way I was proposing it and the way it's framed, only because the way I was proposing it at the last meeting is under an assumption that there's not a need for Path 1 or Path 2. Path 1 and Path 2 can be consolidated, and then we can talk about if an area requires long-term contracting, right? So my core principle is whatever the state regulatory agency requires is paramount. If they do require long-term, then, and the CAISO feels it wants to validate it, it can do so in an ask for permission way for master file, I would assume. If not, then I kind of saw the e-tags as something useful to provide to the state regulatory agencies so that the state environmental regulator can see that the transmission, if it's required, was set up in time. But again, I just want to say that my idea is that the distinction is not necessary. The state rules should be respected and the state can audit it after the fact. But if there is something very clear, the master file could be leveraged to try and create a cyber validation rule.
Okay. Let's see. So this audit-based approach, let me just make sure first, this would be sort of a path 0 or path 1.5 or something that consolidates those two and would avoid the need to classify them as either 1 or 2. It would just be a third option that would obfuscate that. I think that's what you said. I don't know if I used the word obfuscate correctly, but let's move on from that. The other point was that instead of the ISO auditing the type of commitment, this would rely on a state regulatory authority to do that. Is that right, Kathleen?
Sorry, double mute myself, paranoid. This is Cathleen on the double mute. I think that is fair. That my initial thinking is that the state regulatory should do an after the fact audit. I think we should be careful about the level that the CAISO takes on as far as regulating the environmental rules. So I think a principle that I'm putting forward is if the state can make it crystal clear and unambiguous, then CAISO can implement a master file and cyber validation rule. If there's ambiguity, it's not really a responsibility the CAISO should take on. I think that would cause some challenges. So for simplicity and the ability to implement, I think we need to be practical about what can and cannot be done by the CAISO. And so the core concept here is state set up rules. We need to ensure that we are supporting them and not interfering with them, but not also trying to take them on.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, okay, let me do a little bit of rearranging while we have, so Jeff, did you want to raise something? I saw that you had re-raised your hand, and then Doug, I'll get to you shortly.
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX again. I just wanted to acknowledge what Kathleen said, and I think that she raises a valid point. I think back to when Mary and I presented the two paths as possibilities. We also sort of mentioned while we were walking through that it could be that both approaches or some combination of the two might be viable. And so I think, at some point, if ultimately you get to a place where the program requirements are the same or the criteria essentially is the same for whether it's a longer term move to participate within the GHG zone or something that occurs shorter term, if those are generally the same and the treatment from a market dispatch is the same, then maybe it is ultimately that we find a way to accommodate those, both a longer term treatment and a shorter term treatment using the same mechanics. So I don't think that we need to, pull that off the table at all. I think that's reasonable to think through. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yep, thanks. Okay, Doug, thanks for your patience. Doug Howe, do you have any thoughts on this?
This is Doug Howe, PUC MOU Group. Just two comments. I'm not sure it's the case that either the first option or the second option has to be chosen. It's an either or, but you can't do both. And so maybe my comment parallels the ones that were made by Jeff and Kathleen, which is let the state rules decide how they want eligibility and then auditing determined, subject to whether or not it's actually feasible for CAISO to do that. But I agree with the comment that I don't think CAISO should be taking on more responsibility than is absolutely necessary. The second comment that I have, it's really a question. It's not clear to me where a utility-owned resource that is dedicated to serving its own load, where that would show up as a path 1 or as a path 2. I guess in my head, I see it as kind of fitting more under path 1 than under path 2, but it's not clear to me.
Are you referring to a resource that's within the greenhouse gas zone or not?
No, it would be outside.
Yeah.
So both, in the case of Washington, both the Vista and PacifiCorp have resources outside of Washington that will serve load inside of Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the idea is that those resources, if they're dedicated to only serve the non-greenhouse gas zone, is that they could not use this approach because they're dedicated wholly to serve their own native non-GHG zone load. I think that's the premise. So this would only be for resources that have a commitment to serve load within the greenhouse gas zone. That's how I understood it.
But I didn't hear a distinction of difference between what you just said, Kevin. I mean, are you making is the distinction that one resource has a contract and the other resource, the utility owned one, does not have a physical contract? It's a rate-based facility?
Yeah, I think if there is a resource, I think this source-specific path 1 approach is intended to be a resource that's located, say, in Oregon, and wants to serve the greenhouse gas zone, but it has some sort of either a contractual commitment or an oversupply. But if it's committed to serve its own load, then my interpretation was that would not be appropriate for them to be considered in this source-specific approach.
So they would instead go in through path 2?
They would be in that pool that could serve the greenhouse gas zone via the hurdle rate, right? So,
but I guess what I'm not getting the logic of is if that resource, let's just say it's a PacifiCorp resource
mm-hmm.
that's located in Utah or Wyoming,
mm-hmm.
And part of their production goes to serving Washington LSC, why that resource would not have the obligation put on itself to acquire the necessary allowances to meet Washington, Department of Ecology requirements, rather than going in through a kind of blended resource acquisition sort of,
okay. I see Mary Winkie has her hand up, and she might have a better perspective on this. Maybe I can let her respond. Mary?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. This is Mary Winkie with the Public Generating Pool. So, Doug, yeah, I think for an owned resource, it would also be to the extent an owned resource that is external to the GHG zone was dedicated to load inside the GHG zone. I think from my perspective, that would also be a path 1. That would be path 1 treatment. So you would, and when I think of sort of a long-term contract, I am sort of speaking in terms of a long-term commitment. I think that also could be an owned resource.
Okay.
So to me, I think those things are sort of interchangeable.
Okay, that makes sense to me, Mary.
Yeah. And I do think there's a question with respect to sort of, like to the extent a resource is partially committed, like in the PacifiCorp example, you could have other examples too, like if you could have a contract that's a partial commitment to inside the GHG zone. You could have that situation too. I do think that then that might kind of shift into more of a path to treatment, but I think that'd be something that we would need to think about. But again, kind of the concept would be that the quantity of energy dedicated to serve load inside the GHG zone would be treated on a resource-specific basis.
Okay, so we're thinking about it now. So what do we mean by that specifically? So we have a resource that's 100 megawatts. 70% of it is committed to serve. It's physically located in Utah, and 70% of its output is intended to serve Washington. So in that case, what would we do there, Mary? What are you thinking?
So I am not sure the sort of details on the mechanics. I might even ask Jeff to weigh in on that. He may have a better idea than I do, but I think the concept would be that, you know, the 70% would be dedicated to the GHG zone and would not be subject to the hurdle rate. It would be have a resource specific pathway.
Okay. So
but I don't know necessarily if that's sort of a path 1 or path 2 or a path 2A or something like that. I'm not sure.
Okay. So let me just flesh out the example real quick. 70% committed to serve GHG zone. So it sounds like to me that we would have to create a joint owned unit here basically and break the resources production up, 70% to serve the greenhouse gas zone and 30% to serve the non-GHG zone. Is that what we're thinking here, folks? I see some hands up, so maybe I can call on Calli, who we haven't heard from today. Calli?
Yeah, hi, it's Calli Wells with WPTF. So I guess I have a couple questions. I see this possibly working a couple different ways. I guess the first question is, when it's 70%, 30%, is it just a max of 70 megawatts, or is it the first 70 megawatts serve the GHG zone, the last 30 doesn't, or vice versa, where your first 30 megawatts of dispatch cannot serve the GHG zone? So is it more of a stacked split or just capacity split? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it depends how.
Kevin, can I weigh in on that one? This is Doug Howe.
Hey, Doug. Yeah.
So Avista is maybe an easier example than Pacificorp, because Avista has operated for a number of years under a 70-30 split. 70% of the system energy is allocated to Washington, 30% to Idaho. And I think in that case, the 70% allocation, it's not a first, it's not a last. It's a 70% of every megawatt hour. And I think what it means in that case is that the resource owner has a obligation to procure 70% of the total megawatt hours of allowances and submit those to the Department of Ecology to be retired, irrespective of where the energy actually goes. It's an obligation on their part that 70% of their production will end up in an allowance obligation. I think Pacificorp is more complicated, and Mary could probably talk to that better than I could.
Okay, thanks. So Calli, does that help in your line of inquiry here?
It might add a wrinkle to it, but I guess what I was thinking more of a simplistic, where you have a partially contracted resource, and how that could work mechanically. So when you mentioned the joint owner unit, was it JOU?
Yeah.
Under that model, I guess I would have a question of whether or not the market sees them as separate commitments. Like, do each of them have minimum load costs, or are they linked in some way similar to kind of like an MSG modeling approach? Or is it more simplified than that, and it's just you can have in master file, since this is kind of a more longer term commitment to be in this path one, have kind of a max GHG bid and master file at 70 megawatts in this example. So I was kind of going down those three different paths in my mind as to how this split resource could possibly be modeled in the market, but I was trying to understand the mechanics of the joint ownership model itself regarding the commitment costs or, you know, startup costs, if that's taken into account or not.
Yeah, I don't know how it works either. Maybe George does. He's had his hand up and has been patient. George, would you mind really quick just letting us know how commitment costs are split in the JOU model, or if they are currently, and then you can go ahead with your second point if you have one. George?
Certainly. Thank you, Kevin. So regarding the joint ownership unit model, I can only speak hypothetically right now because we don't have that model. We only have a pilot, and that pilot was designed under very specific narrow requirements. But the idea, the fundamental idea of the JOU is that you could have two or more children that could have their own bids, and they could dispatch according to their bids, but yet subject to the physical constraints of their parent. So you have the ability to recognize different attributes for these children, like, for example, they could be pseudo-tied to different BAAs. In this particular case, you could have one of the children slated for serving load in a greenhouse gas regulation area and not the other. Yet you can dispatch them or schedule them based on their individual bids without violating physical constraints for the parent, so you still have a physical, feasible schedule. So that's the fundamental idea, and regarding the commitment costs, there are different ways to go about it, but as I said, we don't have the initiative yet out for a stakeholder process. I think this is coming, so it's very important to realize here that this is a model that will not be in place when we roll out EDAM. So we have to be cognizant that if we rely on a design that JOU model is required, that will not be available. So we should pivot the design here that we want to have for the greenhouse gas model, not to be really dependent on the JOU model, because it will not be there. We have to be practical and realistic about that. Okay. So that's what I wanted to say about the JOU. Later on, I would have some questions about Path 2 whenever you can get back to me, Kevin. Thanks.
Sounds good. Okay, so folks, we can't split a resource using the JOU model because it won't be in place by January 2024. How do we tackle this problem then? Does anyone have any ideas? I see some hands up.
Kevin, sorry. Real quick. I had just a real quick follow-up to that one. So I appreciate that clarification, George. I'm wondering if there's a simpler approach to where you can just do kind of a bid range to where almost like a regulation range, where certain operating range, it can allow a GHG bid into certain megawatt and another can't. Or maybe there's a way to leverage the MSG model functionality on day one. But I'll throw those out there and let somebody else have time. Thanks.
So limit the GHG bid.
Yeah, let's not bring the MSG, because the MSG is really a physical model, and one way to model a JOU that is MSG is to actually model the configurations for the children too, as if the children is like, if I use the term, mini MSG. So you can have the children will follow the same configuration that the parent is at, and the same goes with the commitment. The children follow the commitment of the parent. So if the parent starts, the children start, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, again, these are the ideas that we currently have for the GOU model, but we don't have the initiative, so I think it's futile to just start hypothesizing for this right now. The only way to actually perform a logical split on a resource now without the GOU model is to go ahead and basically make two logical resources out of a physical resource and model them independently. But obviously this is, very bad for the outcome because we cannot guarantee a feasible schedule for the actual physical resource because nothing links back to that. We need the GOU model for that. So I do not recommend that.
Yeah. So pros is that it's possible. Cons is that the bids of resource won't have basis in.
We won't have a feasible schedule for the physical resource. It could be infeasible. We won't be able to observe the physical characteristics and physical constraints because once you split the resource, we only have logical constraints, and it's not easy to satisfy the physical constraints, satisfying the logical constraints, whatever assumptions you may have in place.
Sure. Thanks. All right. So a couple of options that were floated. It doesn't sound like either of them are really feasible. But Calli, maybe I can pull on the thread that you were bringing up, which was to limit the greenhouse gas bid to the allocation percentage multiplied by the megawatt. Do I have that correct here?
Yeah, that was, I was thinking that would be for the scenario where maybe it doesn't require that the first 30 megawatts does not serve the GHG zone in its own, or sorry, yes, the first 30 megawatts does not serve and it has to be above 30 megawatt dispatch to serve the GHG zone. If that is not the case, then I think maybe just limiting the bid, the GHG bid by that percentage would possibly work, but obviously I'm not quite sure exactly how all those contractual arrangements are set up. So it was just a thought to see if that would work.
It's good.
Hey, Kevin, this comes really to the questions that I had, and now that I hear more about it, maybe we need to answer this. All this discussion is about the non-resource specific hurdle rate approach. Am I correct? Because I'm start doubting that now. So in that approach, it's non-resource specific, correct?
No, yeah. So this is an overall discussion of the unspecified or zonal approach. Huh. And then there was a proposal for an alternative pathway that could use a source-specific approach that would not have to go around the hurdle. So it's in the context of the unspecified approach, but this is that sort of alternative pathway.
Okay, so here's where I'm having a little trouble understanding this because you can have one or the other. You can have both. It's either resource specific or non-resource specific. So if it's non-resource specific, there is no greenhouse gas bid. There is no specific attribution to any specific resource outside the greenhouse gas regulation area. What the hurdle rate does is essentially puts a cost for a generic energy transfer between two areas, essentially, and you don't see resources behind it. So I don't even think that we're talking about something that is even well conceived and far from either being workable. I can understand the path one that we move a resource like a pseudo tie for greenhouse gas purposes.
That's what we're talking
about. Okay, but that's path one, right? For path one, you can move the resource, and again, there's no greenhouse gas bid either because that resource, as Jeff said, it's part of the greenhouse gas regulation area now. The costs for greenhouse gas regulation are included in the bid. So I think we're confusing and tripping over these concepts, and I don't think people are going to understand what at the end we're trying to say. There's no greenhouse gas bid here. I think this is confusing the heck out of everything.
So could we limit the energy bid rather than the greenhouse gas bid?
I know, but it's not related. It doesn't get an attribution, right? You have a generic energy transfer.
Because it's basically considered to be part of the greenhouse gas zone. And so,
oh yeah, but that's easy, right? That's easy. You don't need a greenhouse gas bid for that. The energy bid is
yep,
already there. I don't
yep.
understand what is it that you want to limit now in the energy bid?
Well,
It's
the
optimally dispatched.
there was that 70% of the resources output was committed to serve the greenhouse gas zone,
Oh, okay.
and the other 30% was committed to serve
yeah.
else. So
Okay,
we're trying
on that,
how that
I
would
thought
physically.
right, but I thought we answered that. I said the only way to do that is the brute way of actually splitting the resource to two logical resources. That's the only way to do it, and not recommended for the reasons that I did mention. So, is this now a thing we're still talking about it? I thought that we put it to bed. Anyway, okay,
So
I don't want to impede anymore. Go ahead.
Can we not limit the resources bid to 70% of its output? I mean, it seems a little silly, doesn't it?
Do we have two resources or one resource?
One resource.
If it's one resource, is it inside or outside the greenhouse gas regulation area?
It's physically located outside of the area, but it's 70%
Sure.
can serve the greenhouse gas zone.
Okay, so we have to split the resource to two resources. 70% of it is inside and 30% of it is outside. These are two different resources. They have two different energy bids.
Got it. Okay.
That's how you can do it, but it's not a good outcome. Again, I recommend against doing that.
Okay. Thanks, George. So let's see. I think Doug has had his hand raised for a little while. Doug, do you want to go ahead and weigh in?
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear?
I can. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think George is partially right on this. We're making this way too complicated. Okay. I think the way that this works, and this is one of the reasons that I liked Path 1 for this purpose. Let's say this is a 100 megawatt resource. Okay. It's located outside of Washington, but it serves, it is from a purely accounting point of view, 70% of its output is allocated to Washington, 30% to Idaho. It goes in through Path 1. There's no GHG adder, there's no hurdle rate, but it has an agreement with the Washington Department of Ecology that it will surrender, on a 70% of its output in allowances will be surrendered to ecology. All ecology needs to know, and all of the resource owner needs to know, is how much did that resource produce, and then 70% of it is going to have to be submitted in allowances to ecology. I think you don't have to split it into two resources. It's a single resource going in under Path 1, but only 70% of the output gets delivered in allowances. Is that making sense to you now?
When the market dispatches it.
When the market dispatches it.
Well, so the market needs to know how much that resource costs, right? And 70%
so it has an energy bid.
Cost.
No, it has an energy bid. A single energy bid.
Okay. And then the market has to allocate 70% of it to serve
the market doesn't have to do anything. Okay. The allocation 70-30 is an agreement between the PUC of Idaho and the UTC of Washington. It is purely an administrative issue.
Yep. So would you agree, though, that 70% of the output is more expensive than the other 30%? So what energy?
Yes, it is, but it's the obligation. In this case, and in this example, it's Avista. It's Avista's obligation to buy and acquire the allowances and submit them. It is not the market's obligation.
I understand that, but the market, when it's doing its least cost, security constrained optimization, needs to know how much that resource costs, right? So you're saying that we would just assume that it works in the energy bid, that they're making 70% of their megawatts more expensive and the other 30% not expensive. Is that right?
Well, I think this would be up to the UTC to determine what they wanted to do. But that allowance cost, is going into the rate base no matter what, all right? It's going to be included in it's not in the rate base, but it's going to be going into the fuel clause in Washington, and they will pay more for that as a result of the inclusion of those allowance costs in their rates. So Washington ratepayers will pay the GHG adder. They're just not paying it through the market.
I'm afraid we have a non-workable concept here, so we need to probably define it a little better, because we understood the concept that we move for greenhouse gas accounting purposes a resource inside the greenhouse gas regulation area, in which case they can include the cost of regulation in their bid. This is well understood, no problem with that. Now, if we're saying that the resource is not getting this treatment, it's still outside, but somehow we recognize this resource separately from all other resources and try to do something different with a hurdle rate that applies to all of these resources generically, I don't think this is a workable concept. This is a non-resource specific approach for all resources outside the greenhouse gas regulation area, according to which you can't have specific arrangements for any of these resources because you don't see that. You don't have visibility at the resource specific level. All of them is like one big generator that generates energy, and some of it, based on the hurdle rate economics, can serve load in the greenhouse gas regulation area. There is no attribution on any specific resource, right? So we have to keep that in mind.
Okay, let's hear from Jeff on this. Jeff, where are we going wrong? Why are we confused? And how would this work?
Well, I think it's Jeff Spires with PowerX. I think in my mind we should focus on the general solution here and on the mechanics for typical resources or typical situations, because I think what we're talking about here, you have multiple owners of a single resource. Those different owners want that single resource to be treated differently, and you're trying to grapple with how do you split essentially a single resource into how do you allocate its output in two different ways, and that's a complexity and a challenge that I think would be faced under pretty much any market design. And I think it even extends beyond GHG when you have potentially different entities that want to bid their resource differently. So that's just a complex problem to begin with. And I don't think we should let the solution or the merits of the overall solution be determined by spending this amount of time on it. The other thing I would point out is I think what Doug sort of characterized it as potentially more of an administrative issue. And I think that's a really good point, to the extent that there are some scenarios that are just difficult to grapple with under the market solution itself. There could be settlements outside of the market that address some of those unique circumstances that the overall approach doesn't necessarily address perfectly. And I don't think that means that that's a negative of the design. It's just the reality that there might be some more complicated situations that we have to figure out how to work with. So I guess my general conclusion is that we're kind of down a narrow area that, yes, it's complicated, but it shouldn't be the sole element of the discussion when we have kind of higher level issues we're grappling with.
Okay, noted, but we're past the higher level part of the conversation, and we need to get into how this approach actually works. And if I'm looking at this, I don't understand how a resource could qualify for path one if it's not wholly committed to serve the greenhouse gas zone. And there will be resources that don't want to commit 100% of their output into California or Washington. And if we're not able to address that question through path one or through the unspecified approach, then I don't know how it's a feasible approach. So we can set this aside and put it in the parking lot because we have other conversations to hold around this, but this cannot be an open area.
Well, my response to that would be that that's what I think path two enables, because it gives an opportunity for an entity to submit on a particular time frame the amount of the resource that is being delivered to that zone. And if that's a result of a contractual obligation for part of the resource, the entity is able to do that.
Okay, so then path 1 only applies to resources that are 100% committed to serve GHG zone. Okay. All right, so let's move on to path 2. These are the shorter term ones where you know, a resource can make this election more frequently. I'm seeing several hands are still up. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on this before we move on to path 2?
Hi, Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I continue to think path 1 and path 2 differences are irrelevant, and I will just try to articulate why. And I think with the discussion that you had, experiences in both. So I really don't want folks to get confused, so I'm trying to make this super crystal clear. I only see one meaningful difference between path 1 and path 2, and I'd like Mary and Jeff to confirm my understanding so that we can also help clarify if I'm confused, so I'm with the team, or if others are confused, that it's all on board. So the only real difference I see between path 1 and path 2 is an idea that path 1 says state requires resources that can get around the hurdle to have long-term arrangements in order to do so, whether that's long-term contracts, long-term transmission rights. I'm just saying long-term arrangements, so it's something more stable. Versus path 2 is a state program that allows for resources to be able to serve that area on a much more agile basis. So let's say on an hourly basis. You can go out and procure that excess or surplus energy from a resource on an hour for a specific hour, a couple hours in advance or a day in advance, depending on what is there, based on those real-time, kind of day-ahead real-time forecasts. That's a short-term arrangement. So trying to keep this very simple. Path 1 is long-term arrangements. Path 2 is short-term arrangements. My premise has been that the mechanics should be the same. The eligibility is what we're talking about. Eligible, long-term versus short-term. And I think that those rules can be set by the state and implemented by the state, or if we can clearly define long-term master file, and that only, like Washington's rule says that you have to have a long-term arrangement. So if a master file flag includes long-term arrangement and it's a yes, then when you submit your pre-showing megawatt, which, you know, as I proposed, should be done through the greenhouse gas bid megawatt, to remind George, the premise of using that language here was that it's redefined as this is my contracted megawatt. Then the cyber rule could be set to reject it from being sent to the market if the master file flag isn't there. However, if there isn't a requirement for a long-term arrangement, no cyber rule should be in place to reject that showing. So if it's able to be procured on an hour-ahead basis and it is shown, it should be able to go into the market. So this is my question for Jeff or Mary. Have I understood the difference correctly as long-term, short-term, or is there a different nuance that you'd like to clarify?
Mary, do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, there we go. Now I'm unmuted. Thank you. Yeah, I think, I'm interested in Jeff's perspective too, but I think I agree. I think the difference has to do with the eligibility requirements and then potentially the reporting requirements, so that how that resource is treated by the regulator, both from an eligibility and then a reporting perspective. But I'm not sure there's truly anything mechanically different about how the kind of the treatment actually works in the market. But I'm curious on Jeff's perspective on that too.
Okay, I'm going to go to Jeff, and then I'm going to go to George. Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff Spires of PowerX. I like the way Kathleen framed that, and I largely agree that, ultimately we might find that these start to sort of consolidate around a single approach from a mechanics point of view, but some of the treatment might be based on program requirements that are longer, based on longer term contracts. So, I don't disagree with that. And I think if we could get to a point where there's really just one path that covers all range of possibilities, that might be more straightforward. And so that I would think that would make sense to think of it in that light.
Okay. Yeah, I am in agreement on that as well. So we have two potential mechanics here of how this might work. I'm not sure what the purpose of these mechanics are, but maybe somebody can help me understand that. So we have an approach that requires e-tags to be submitted for some reason, and one that does not. So what am I like? Which approach should we take, and what are the relative merits of each one? I said that I would give George a chance to weigh in, and then I'll go to Stuart Kelly after that.
No, thank you, Kevin. I think, I share your thoughts here. You said for some reason ATAGs, and I don't understand that either. In fact, I have issues with the entire Path 2 approach. I don't understand it. I don't know how it can work out and how we can even potentially implement it as part of a non-resource specific approach. Those e-tags and information specific for resources,
this is for a source-specific approach that goes around the hurdle rate. It's not related to the hurdle rate at all. This would be.
So this is the resource-specific approach?
That's
okay.
The broader model of the unspecified or zonal approach. Yes.
So this Path 2 is not related to the non-resource specific approach?
So this source-specific pathway was added to the hurdle rate approach because there was concerns that using the hurdle rate approach that it might crowd out or limit the ability for non-emitting resources in the non-GHG zone to serve the
Absolutely.
GHG. Right?
Yes,
So,
yes, we did discuss that before. Yeah, I understand that. The Path 1, I understand it. What I don't understand is what is Path 2? What is the reason for the ETAG? Why do you need that? How the ISO can verify an ETAG? We cannot do that. And then the statement market optimizes tagged megawatt quantities. I don't even know what that means. How can we do that? We only optimize a generic transfer between two areas based on a hurdle rate. We don't even see individual resources. We don't see how these resources contribute to the transfer. It's not relevant. It's not part of the proposal. So this whole Path 2 is a serious undermining of the entire proposal. We have to be very careful. How do we articulate this? Because it will bring the entire proposal down. I don't understand any of it. I don't know what this is.
Yeah. Maybe somebody in the audience can help us get over that hurdle. Can anyone succinctly articulate what the purpose of this tagging-based approach is? And maybe I'll go to Jeff, and then, I'm sorry, Stuart, I'll go to you afterwards. Jeff?
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX, and I do apologize for taking up so much of the call when I know others need to be able to weigh in, but I'll try to explain the concept again so that it's clear to George and others what the idea here is. If the concept is we are trying to determine imports into a particular jurisdiction for purposes of GHG. And if you have a state program that is looking for imports into their state, then there needs to be a mechanism to demonstrate that your resource was delivered to that state. Having a design in the market that just deems delivery when it hasn't actually occurred is not the right outcome, and we've talked about that a lot. So the solution that I was proposing was that an entity would submit effectively a base schedule ahead of the day-ahead market, and that would be supported by an E-tag. And what that does is it shows that that entity, rather than just selling at their specific location, which is an organized market, all generators are selling their output at their location, they're getting the locational price, etc. Instead of doing that, what you're doing by submitting that base schedule and that E-tag is that you are showing that you are taking your resource and delivering it to another location. And that is a clear demonstration that, first of all, that resource was actually deliverable and scheduled to that other jurisdiction, that there was transmission to support that delivery, and that the entity intended for that resource to be used for that purpose. And that is very consistent with the existing requirements for CARB in the bilateral markets, in which imports into California are treated on a resource-specific basis from a GHG perspective when they have a contract and when they have an E-tag showing delivery into the state. So that is the concept, and the reason that that's important is because it is establishing criteria to validate delivery to a particular jurisdiction and avoid the challenges of deeming. So I hope that that's helpful, at least at a high level, to explain what the suggestion is.
Jeff, two questions. I'm going to ask the most important
Kevin.
one first.
Guys, hold on.
Just a moment.
People are jumping in before
So
I've called.
I understand what you described, Jeff. Let me ask this first, because I think this is most important. What is your expectation that the market optimization will do with this information? The tag, all this information, all what you said. What do you expect the market will do? How is it going to act on that? Because I don't see it factoring in any way in the solution that we're going to have, which is a transfer from one area into another area, the hurdle rate that results in some revenue being collected for greenhouse gas. That's the outcome, right? So how do you expect this particular information to have any relevance or any use in that?
The base scheduled quantity, let's just use PowerX as an example. If we have a base scheduled quantity of 100 megawatts from BC to, let's assume it's going to California, and we are showing that delivery, then that 100 megawatts is treated through the market. It avoids the hurdle rate. It's not part of the calculation.
How are we going to do that when we only represent a transfer from area 1 to area 2 at a hurdle rate? We can't see the resources behind that. How are we going to exempt a resource from the hurdle rate? And I don't even know what that means. We only calculate a generic transfer, an energy exchange between two areas. We don't see individual resources in this. So what is the mechanism that we're going to use to exempt a specific resource from that hurdle rate when we don't even have a mechanism other than what we discussed under Path 1? So that's why I can't see how Path 2 is going to affect in any way the solution.
The software would have to be able to receive that 100 megawatt schedule and then calculate imports for purposes of the hurdle rate. So generic market imports that schedule is not a part of. So the software would have to be able to calculate, which obviously mathematically is straightforward, but you would have to be able to say, I have 100 megawatts of imports into California that are base scheduled and they do not face the hurdle rate. And if the market optimization dispatches, say, another 50 megawatts, of generic import energy through the dispatch, that quantity would face the hurdle rate.
So the way you're describing it's not optimized. What you're saying is that you run the model, you find out that there's 1,000 megawatt transfer, and you say 100 out of this 1,000 megawatt, it's coming from this base schedule. Is that what you're saying?
I think it could be optimized. I would submit that 100
How?
megawatt ahead. Pardon me?
How? We only have a transfer with a hurdle rate. Are you saying that we're going to have another transfer that is not part of this optimization for 100 megawatts without a hurdle rate? It's forced in. It's like a self-schedule. How can you optimize? You can't optimize that. You either have it or not.
I think I probably agreed with about 75% of that. I think you would have two different transfer calculations, the quantities that are associated with the base schedules and the quantities that are not. So you would have to separate those quantities. But I think there are ways to allow for both of those to be optimized.
Okay, but you have to be careful, Jeff. Now you're changing the proposal. This is a different proposal altogether. If you're saying we have to have 2 transfers or 30 transfers because there are 29 of these resources, we're talking about a completely different approach that needs to be discussed separately as another option. Don't bring it here. This is not the same proposal that we were talking about for so long. You agree?
No, I don't agree with it. Well, I don't know what we're doing.
Well, it's not the same proposal, Jeff.
Guys, I'm gonna cut this off here. I don't think that we have the mechanics figured out right now, but we have a lot more ground to cover. We're only, this is still the first topic. So unfortunately, I'm gonna have to put this path 1 versus path 2 in the parking lot for now, because it doesn't seem that we're converging on a solution here. And I recognize that a lot of people have had their hand up and have been waiting patiently, but I have to move on, and I'm sorry for that. I'm going to move on to the topic of compliance and reporting. So as a reminder, we have this 2-zone concept here, where we have a greenhouse gas zone and a non-greenhouse gas zone. There are 2 ways for the non-greenhouse gas zone to serve the greenhouse gas zone. One was the one that we were just talking about, the source-specific way of doing that, which we weren't able to reach resolution, at least on the path 2 there. But there is the other way, which is where the price differential between the GHG and non-GHG zone is high enough such that it can overcome a hurdle rate. Once that happens, there is a transfer from the non-GHG zone to the GHG zone. That transfer, because it's being imported into the GHG zone, is subject to meeting compliance obligations. So I want to focus in on that idea and talk about how resources that don't use that source-specific pathway, in other words, the portion of non-GHG zone that clears the hurdle rate, how the compliance and reporting aspects of that works. So what we've done is I've tried to, I'm going to put this all on the same page so we can see, identify there's a reporting obligation and then there's a compliance obligation when that non-GHG zone serves the GHG zone. The reporting obligation is a responsibility to notify CARB or the Department of Ecology in Washington of the emissions related to that transfer. And then secondarily, there's a compliance obligation whereby those emissions embodied in the import generate the need to procure, hold, and retire allowances under the greenhouse gas program in question. In my mind, there are 6 different options for how the reporting and compliance obligations could be allocated. It could be that that obligation is allocated to the non-GHG EDAM entities entirely, or maybe just a subset of those EDAM entities that were net exporting in the particular hour in question. What was being proposed in the unspecified or zonal approach summary that's posted onto the working group website is that responsibility is allocated to the load serving entities within the GHG zone. A different option might be that the ISO reports and complies with the, reports the emissions and has to procure and hold the allowances. Or those funds could either be distributed to a third entity who would do that, or a direct distribution back to the regulatory body to retire those obligations. So what I'd like to do is talk about how we think this works in the unspecified or zonal approach here. And do we want to split the reporting and compliance obligation between these entities? Like perhaps it could be that the ISO is responsible for reporting the emissions behind it, but the load serving entities are responsible for procuring, holding, and retiring the allowances related to that. So I'd like to open up the call for first, do we think that these responsibilities should be divided across different entities? And then second, which entities should bear these obligations? So if anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd encourage you to raise your hand and let's have that conversation. I see that Mary and Kathleen have their hands up. So I'll go to Kathleen first and then Mary.
Sure. Cathleen Colbert from Vistra. So I think that the reporting and compliance entity for the most part will stay the same, will be a load serving entity. And I think that we should acknowledge that the CAISO will need to not only report to CARB, but to potentially, let's say, Washington's Department of Ecology, if that's who it gets reported to. But so generally speaking, CAISO will need to report some information to the state regulators for their use, and then load serving entities would need to report the amount of unspecified imports they received. And then same thing as if there are imports under those source specified, then they would have that obligation to report. So it's really just what we do today, with the exception of adding the unspecified, which I would note unspecified is something that also happens. But I think in the context of this, it would be the LSEs that was reported. I'm curious for feedback from Mary, Jeff, and others.
Okay, thanks. Mary? Mary Winky.
Hear me? Oh.
Yes.
Thanks, Kevin. So I agree. I think that the sort of probably simplest solution is to have the load serving entities within the GHG zone responsible for both reporting and compliance. I think the data has to come from CAISO. So, CAISO can either be the reporting entity, or I think if CAISO, transmits the data to the load serving entities, they could be the reporting entity. And that's, from my perspective, that's probably the cleanest way to do it. It also gives the regulator, an entity to enforce its program against. And I think that's probably an important aspect of the regulatory function in both states. So having that entity identified, I think, is important. The other thing I'll note, too, and we talked about this a little bit in our presentation.
Mary, can I hop in? So just to make sure I understood what you were saying. So you were saying that the EDAM load serving entities would bear the compliance obligation, but that the CAISO would bear the reporting obligation. Is that what I understand?
No, I think what I'm suggesting is that the load serving entities would be both the reporter and the compliance entity.
Okay.
The data would have to come from CAISO.
Okay. So
CAISO would need to transmit the data, the relevant information, to the load serving entities for them to be able to report. And that's how it works today in the EIM. The CAISO provides data to EIM entities regarding their imports into California, and that's what they report.
Okay. Yeah, I understand. Thanks. Okay, go ahead. Sorry for interrupting you.
That's okay. I just wanted to add the additional context that we did talk about in our presentation the other day, but just that my view of this is that it's really an administrative function, that the market solution has, quantified the emissions, dispatched in accordance with, in the way it was supposed to, if you will, and collected the correct amount of revenue to purchase allowances. So I just want to, I don't view this as sort of adding an additional obligation per se. It's a revenue neutral solution and administratively necessary to ensure that those allowances are retired out of the program.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin.
So, thank you. So just a point to make clear is that this isn't the ISO deciding how Washington or California's relevant regulatory agencies would work. I'm just trying to characterize how this works in the context of this unspecified approach. So the next question will be, as we go down, basically, and this is where I think we need some clarification. I'm not really sure how this works. If the model needs to work in a particular way, does this require changes via a regulatory rulemaking process? So I don't want to leave that hanging, but this is just kind of a brainstorming session on how this might work. So the next hand I saw up was Anthony. Anthony, do you want to hop in here?
Hello. I have a couple things I mentioned before, and I sent another thing through the questions through this working group, and I just joined not too long ago, so I hope you didn't answer it already, but this is the perfect time to address my question.
Yes. Can you introduce yourself first? Sorry, just
yeah. This is Anthony Diacola, City, Pasadena.
Thank you.
Yeah, EDAM is a day-ahead market,
Mm-hmm.
and my question is, why are we spending so much time talking about the reporting aspects of the clearing of what's going on in a day-ahead market when I don't know about the other states, but at least for CARB's perspective, which is what the ISO's energy would be reported to, it's based on actual flow. So whatever clears in the day ahead may settle financially. The carbon price may impact pricing and things like that, but the actual CARB reports and obligations are specific to the actual energy that comes out of the real-time market. So that's question number one.
Let me answer that one really quick.
Okay.
So the proposal or the zonal approach really was proposed to apply both to the day ahead and real-time markets. So this is not only a proposal to for like a new day ahead market, but to revise how the real-time market works. So hope that's helpful. Does that answer question one?
Okay. Yeah, that's question one. The other one is, I'm not necessarily in agreement with what was just said. In the current EIM market, my research tells me that ISO has the obligation. They're the ones with all the information. They report it to CARB, and CARB reduces our administrative allowances that are granted to us. So we're the ones who ultimately bear the cost in a roundabout way as a load serving entity. It's not the ISO, and transferring that responsibility, if that is the way that it goes, we need to be very sure of what's being passed on from the ISO, who has all the information about what energy is flowing, where it's coming from, to us, who today we don't have to provide that information. Like I said before, ISO is providing to CARB. So my preference would be to stay that way. We shouldn't have it working one way in EIM and then have another one working in real time or the EDAM.
Yeah. So there's different. Let me pull up the presentation from the California Resources Board if I can find it. But there is currently today in EIM, there is an EIM deeming mechanism where the EIM deems megawatts delivered to California based on greenhouse gas bids submitted by EIM scheduling coordinators. In that case, the compliance obligation is with the EIM entity for those deemed megawatts. CARB then does an additional calculation to calculate what they call, I think, and CARB folks, feel free to yell at me if I'm saying incorrect things here. But I'm just going to pull up the presentation. Thanks for your patience, everybody. So I'm just going to show this calculation. So what I was referring to is this component. So there's the EIM algorithm deems EIM emissions delivered to California. CARB also has this concept of EIM outstanding emissions, and those are the ones that are allocated on a pro rata share to LSEs within California. So currently it's a shared responsibility. Does that make sense, Anthony?
Yeah, with that clarification, yes. I'll have to go back and do my own research and see where that piece is, because I've yet to see an invoice. But I guess if it's going to the EIM entity, I wouldn't see it anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I understand what you're telling me. I'll have to go back and double check myself, though. I appreciate it.
Yeah, that's correct. Is if we were to pursue the unspecified or zonal approach, this would be an incremental amount of megawatts that are being allocated to the load serving entities beyond the EIM outstanding emissions. This would basically be any emissions that clear the hurdle rate are allocated to the load serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone. I'll go to Claire next. Claire?
Thank you, Kevin.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Kevin. Claire Bradinch, WPTF. Just a couple of things. One, in response to a question you asked about changes to the CARB's rules. We would definitely see that if this approach were implemented, it would require some changes to CARB's rules. But we would also see that the proposal of that the CAISO staff put forward would also require changes to CARB's rules. So I don't think that's necessary decision making amongst the two. And just in terms of the conversation you just had in terms of the model, I mean, the model currently under CARB is that the CAISO for EIM imports provides information to the scheduling coordinator about the deeming. And they also provide that information to CARB via a subpoena so that CARB can verify that information is reported correctly. So I think what Mary suggested is an approach that would be modeled kind of on that idea that the CAISO provides information to both the load serving entity and the California Air Resources Board to verify what is reported by the load serving entities. And then finally, it makes me a little bit nervous that we're talking about this bit without immediately jumping into the settlement. We've had some discussions internally about how this would work, and if this approach is ultimately adopted, and if the obligation does fall on the load serving entities within the greenhouse gas zone, we would see that there is a need for the ISO to recycle revenue to those load serving entities that it collected from the hurdle, and to do that on a load basis so that there is in fact revenue there for the load serving entities to acquire allowances. Thank you.
Yeah, and that is what is spelled out in the unspecified approaches settlement issues. That hurdle rate revenue is collected and redistributed to the load serving entities within the GHG zone, who will then report those emissions. So does that answer your last question there, Claire?
No, it wasn't. Just that you see it the same way, but just sort of flag that we also see it that way.
Cool. Okay. Thanks for that input. And if you folks don't have any questions, please please lower your hands. I do see. Let's see. Phil, you've had your hand up for a little while. Phil Schofield, please go ahead.
Just about to take it down. My concern was that we're going to pay for the GHG the cost of the emissions in the LMP and then also report it. I didn't see this return of that revenue. So that's pretty important. Sorry, Phil Schofield, Southern California Edison, a load serving entity.
Yeah.
In the GHG zone. So I'm still not sure how enthusiastic I am about that, but at least it's a single, or there's not a double count.
Yeah, understood. Thanks, Phil. I'm going to go to Anya next. Anya, did you have a question here?
Thanks, Kevin. And I'm sorry, this is slightly tangential, but I did want to go back to Claire's comment. Claire, I think I heard you mention that the resource-specific approach would require changes in CARB regulation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what about the approach you think would require those changes. So, Kevin, if we need to table this for later, that's fine, but I have that open question. And this is Anya Gilbert with CAISO. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I do want to say focus on the unspecified approach, but let's see if we can have a chance to raise that in a later meeting, or if Claire, you want to send a note to the group, that would be helpful. The next hand I saw up was Alva Svoboda, and then I'll go to Vijay afterwards. Alva.
Hi, this is Alva Svoboda, PG&E. I just wanted to raise sort of one of the conceptual problems I have with this approach is with this question of, so essentially load serving entities, people who bid load within the GHG zones are going to pay for GHG imports that carry GHG, and the hurdle rate is going to represent the minimum cost that they're going to have to pay for that. But they're doing that day ahead, as you pointed out, and they can reverse that position in different ways. Each load serving entity can reverse their position in different ways in real time. So I do think the ISO has to be much more involved in that process. Essentially, there's an allocation process in the day-ahead market where you have to determine how you're allocating those incremental those imports from the non-GHG zone based on the bids that were submitted by the load serving entities. You're going to have to determine if any additional imports are required by RUC, how those get allocated to each of the load serving entities. And then you have to determine how to reverse anything that needs to be reversed in real time. So to me, there's a heavy dependence on a settlements-like process that CAISO would administer, which would also cause incentives over time in the market to change. I don't think it's undoable, but I think it's something that has to be recognized. This is not a mere accounting exercise. It is something that will lead to differences in incentives over time in terms of how people bid into day ahead versus real time, whether they bid at a level that's incorporates the expectation that they're going to be importing emitting resources or not. Do they have some way with their bid to try to avoid importing emitting resources? That all has to be accounted for, because that's how the market is set up. Load serving entities bid to whatever level they want at a given price, and the ISO then has to determine how to allocate those costs to the LSEs.
Yeah. So if I may just see if I understand where you're coming from. So if in IFM it's an economic market and load is bid in economically, there would be one set of numbers that would determine the megawatts imported from the non-GHG zone into the GHG zone. Then the RUC process comes in, and now we're clearing against a load forecast, which would result in a slightly different number, a higher number, basically. And then when we move into the real time, the the load that's actually needed might change,
That's
which
right.
might result in finally a different number. So it's not as simple as just collecting a pot of money and then distributing it out. Is that
That's right. And sort of the current approach, the non-specific megawatts are allocated just the same way that a lot of charges are allocated in the ISO after all the market processes have been taken care of, which is really it's to real-time imbalances and then to all loads, or at least that's my picture of it. I could be wrong, but something like that is going on now, because you know, you have a certain pot of allowances that you have to allocate to load in some way, and typically that's the way the ISO does it. I'm ignorant of the details of this, but that's generally the way you allocate charges that aren't based on specific bids. So I think you have to pull back from that. You have to do the whole cost allocation to the different load serving entities carefully from step one in order to make this work. And like I said, it's important because that then influences the bidding behavior of the load serving entities, which influences how the market clears.
Yep. Thanks, Al. That's some great points. I promised that we'd go to Vijay after. So Vijay, do you want to hop in here?
Yes, thank you. This has been very valuable discussion. Thanks to Mary and Jeff for bringing the unspecified approach to the table. I think Alva has really hit on a thought I wanted to clarify is, I think we've heard the word settlement or reporting very frequently, in the sense that once the dispatch happens, we'll have the reporting compliance. So I put in the chat box if that can be shared with a larger group, but I feel like this table needs to be slightly clarified with a third column, which is not just entity responsible, but a first column before that will be the market operator role, as in CalISO here. Because there is a role for CalISO as a market operator running the EDAM, and to what Alva was talking about, some of the revenue management or cost allocation that is associated with the so-called settlement. Then there is two different elements. One is the reporting and compliance. So the way I look at it is you have who is responsible, which is the complying entities, and then who is to be informed, that is your reporting entities. So I feel there needs to be a clarification for CalISO specific role. So that's one comment. And my second is, I think
before we move on, so the ISO would be responsible for the data reporting. Maybe
so given the lack of certainty or clarification on how the optimization will comport with the defining the hurdle rate and the interaction between the GHG and non-GHG zones, I feel like there will be some kind of clarity that will need to come into play, and that CalISO will have an additional step in either reallocating the allowances that got retired or adjusted and the price impacts associated with it, that is separate than just pure reporting out like you do 7 days later when the final settlement comes out with the transactions and the bids that took place. So I think to what Alva was just bringing up, that really fit. I didn't have the nuances and mechanics of how some of the immediate post-optimization transactions take place, but that's what I meant by clarifying. We'll need to clarify what would be specific market operator roles that need to happen to, my English words, close out a complete optimized transaction involving GHG, non-GHG zones. And then comes the other two steps, which we all like to know and talk about, is the reporting to whom and compliance by whom. So I just want to clarify that. Thank you.
Okay, and did you have a second question? Sorry.
The comment was, I was curious about what you meant in this table by third-party entity. Thank you.
That would just be like a third entity that would not be the ISO, that would either separate from the EDAM entities, regardless of whether they're load serving entities within the GHG zone or exporters in the non-GHG zone. This would be a third party entity
Got it.
I don't know who it would be, but yeah.
Okay. No, thank you for that. And Chair WRA, thank you.
Thank you. Anya and Anthony, I see your hands are still up. If you don't have a question, please lower them. Oof, I lost everybody. All right. I did see that the next hand was Mary Winky. Mary, would you go ahead and raise your hand if it's not raised, and unmute. Michelle, I lost a bunch of people who had their hands raised. Maybe I can ask the folks on the call to re-raise your hand. Or
yes, I wanted to clear the queue, and then I asked folks to re-raise their hand if they had a question.
Okay. Hey, no worries. All right. Mary, you're unmuted now. Would you go ahead?
Thanks, Kevin. I think I had a follow-up question for Alva, the point that was being made there, and maybe I'm just not understanding the point, but it seems like the issue that you're raising would exist regardless of sort of who the dollars collected are allocated to. If you need to be sort of updating the quantity collected over different time horizons. So I think the sort of follow-up question is it really a function of allocating the revenue to the load serving entities, or is it a broader issue with the overall solution? And if it is an issue with allocating the revenue to the load serving entities, do you have another thought about how the revenue should be redistributed?
Thanks. Alva, if you have any thoughts on that, please raise your hand. I'm going to let folks hop in with any other thoughts. We've got about 10 minutes left before we're going to do the recap. So maybe I will.
I was just unmuted, Kevin. Do you want me to quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I helpfully unmuted in the middle of your discussion there. Sorry. So I think it's sort of the obvious distinction is between resource specific, where all of the calculations are done on the supply side. And so basically you're just increasing or decreasing the allocation based on the schedule, versus the load side. And specifically because on the load side, the EDAM design, mimicking the ISO day at market design, it has a bid-in load construct for the IFM. And so participants can decide how much they want to pay to pay for load in day ahead. You then have to decide if different load serving entities are not going to meet the same percentages of their final load, and they may in fact not be willing to pay. Actually, I'm probably just I'm going to have to. I think actually everybody has to pay a common price. So whatever they pay is going to be the result of their bid. I don't know where the hurdle rate would come into that. It's not really going to affect one participant different from others, except for the fact that they may decide that they're going to want to buy less of their load, say day ahead, or more of their load day ahead, based on these results. So each load serving entity gets a different result out of the day ahead market. They get a certain allocation of the EDAM of the transfer, the GHG transfer. There's some additional transfer coming through the RUC process, and then that transfer may be partially unwound. It may be increased. Whatever happens in real time has to be also then allocated to each of the load serving entities, presumably based on the difference between their actual loads and their settled loads. That's the way I would picture it.
Yep, thanks. We have a settlements SME on, which is James Lynn. Maybe he can weigh in and see if what Alva was saying makes sense, and if he has anything to say about Mary's question. James? And James, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first. It looks like also you might be double muted. You're unmuted in WebEx.
Hello, everybody. This is James Lynn. I'm the Senior Advisor at the ISO for Market Settlement Design. So I was listening to what you were saying, Alva, and I agree with a part of it, and I still would have to think through another part of it. So the first part is the day ahead. Yeah, regarding if it's resource specific or the zonal or path 1, path 2 design, we are going to have to deal with an imbalanced settlement between day ahead and real time. Now, the inclusion of ROC, I'll have to think about that further because ROC is more of a commitment of the resources in order to start up or bid into real time. So I'm not sure we'll actually have incremental greenhouse gas transfers. I'll have to think that one out. But when it comes to the allocation, when it comes to imbalance settlement, from a day-ahead perspective, yeah, if we're allocating to load, we'll have to think of the best methodology, but it'll probably is pro rata of that greenhouse gas regions, day-ahead load schedules. And if I was thinking about imbalance energy in real time, you might be looking at something like uninstructed imbalance energy would be who we would allocate it to. So we'll have to do more discussions on that, but you are correct that there will be a deviation settlement between real time and day ahead.
Cool. Thanks, James. That was helpful. So I will go to Kathleen and Claire in just a moment, but I want to frame up what we still need to tackle in this area, which is, in my mind, the question of one, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. We're going to have multiple states that have that are in the greenhouse gas zone when EDAM goes live, and we'll need to figure out how that works. So if, say, for example, California is a net importer in a particular hour, but Washington is a net exporter, do we factor that in? How do we factor in the fact that Washington is going to treat all emissions at the unspecified rate? I'm not sure if that'll matter, but there's definitely some conversations around there being two states effective here that I'm not sure that we've fully thought out. So yeah, with that, I will go to Kathleen and then Claire. And if we don't have any more time, I'll turn it over to Brian for the recap. So Kathleen.
Great, thanks. I'll be really brief. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I just wanted to respond to some of the comments that I heard today about this idea not meriting further work. And I want to put forward that Vistra, we believe that this idea of a zonal approach with the ability to get around it is very theoretically and practically sound. I also believe we can work through it and come up with a design, but we have to stay super focused and practical as we do that and move faster. But I wanted to be make sure that at least our voice was heard, that this idea does merit working on. We do think there is a workable approach to it. And so just want to really encourage the CAISO not to take this idea off the table. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Kathleen. Let's, looking at the schedule, I think we have time to continue that conversation in the working groups. So we will continue that conversation. I just needed to move on from the particular topic. If you have any thoughts, feel free to send them to me and the other folks that have been involved in today's conversation. Maybe we can have an offline conversation and take it back to the group next week. So thank you for that feedback, and we appreciate you sharing your opinion. Claire?
Thanks, Kevin. Hey, and Kevin, were you asking for responses for this last issue you teed up?
No, I think we'll have to save that for next week.
Okay, well,
But if you have,
I'll have a thought on that. But just also, WPTF also still supports exploring this further. And one thing I just want to say again, I realize, listening to George today, I know he sounded a little confused about the proposal, and clearly this is a proposal that's evolving, kind of beyond what the first presentation was to the second presentation, and then many of us are contributing some other ideas. But it's still, to me, and I'm not an expert on the mechanics of the model, it still very much reminds me of a solution that was put forward in the discussions around revising the EIM greenhouse gas algorithm in 2017 to deal with secondary dispatch that involved a hurdle as well as some ability for resource-specific deeming. We may be calling it something else here in terms of resources being committed or assigned to the greenhouse gas zone or partially committed to the greenhouse gas zone. But my kind of ignorant thinking is, if the CAISO thought it could work then, why is it different now? So I just want to put that out there and hope that we can further have conversations about this next week. Thanks.
yeah, thanks, Claire. It is that same proposal, or at least it is the evolution of that. And I agree with your comment that this really has been a productive effort, and we've pushed the idea forward with valuable contributions from a number of folks, and I hope you will agree with me on that. I'm going to go to Petter because we have a little bit of time left. Petter, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself first.
Hey, Karen, this is Petter from SGN. It's very difficult to talk about this zonal proposal without having a clear mathematical formulation how that can be solved. I'm with George. I cannot think about how that can be solved. And what was tried in 2017 was different than this zonal. So it's not big formulation. It's similar to what was put originally for EIM. It's just one page. So if Jeff can work out on that and show that it's feasible to do this, it's worth considering. But to continue this kind of discussion, somebody says it's going to work, somebody says it's not going to work, somebody says it's going to calculate something accurately, this one. It's very difficult to follow up the discussion without really having clear formulation how this is going to work. And that will help everybody to figure out, do we drop that or we continue with two options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And, I don't want to put the whole burden on Jeff. And I know that I couldn't work up a set of objective functions and constraints and stuff that might be useful in this, but it will be something that if this approach is adopted, will have to be done. So duly noted, Petter, and thank you for the comment.
I don't know how you can adopt the approach without seeing formulation if you don't know it's going to work.
I agree.
So,
so I will go to, I see that Aditya has her hand raised. Excuse me, Aditya, did you want to, what weigh in? Okay, maybe they can ask their question at a later date. Aditya, yeah, do you want to go ahead?
Hey, Kevin, good afternoon. Sorry, I lowered my hand too quickly. I was like, okay, I'm in the queue. I thank you to Petter for raising that. He echoes, and George earlier echoed my concerns. The both of them are basically, I'm just repeating what they're saying, but first off, I'll start with what Petter said. I would need to see the equations with the objective function, the constraints. I don't know. I mean, I can't make sense of really what would happen. There are too many exogenous variables involved here. And it would help if Jeff would provide us with those. I mean, I understand what you said about putting the burden on him, but the thing is, he would most accurately represent what he's trying to convey, rather than, a third party making the functional forms, and then that's not what he's trying to convey. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in general, my at minimum, the concern I would have here is I do not see how like this kind of hybridized kind of approach would not compromise the hurdle rate calculation. But, other questions could come into mind too. And just because an approach has been somewhat used in the past in one form or way, does not necessarily, in my opinion, give it a warrant of, basically carte blanche that it can be used every single time. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I hope that folks have hopefully felt that the last few meetings have been a change in tone, that we as a working group are trying to close out these issues. Brian, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to give you one more pause to give Stuart a chance to raise his hand, because he's been trying to weigh in this whole time. So, Stuart, you've got about 3 minutes, and then we got to kick it over for the recap and talk about next meeting. So, go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, I guess I see the challenges with the zonal approach. There's definitely mathematical things that need to be overcome. A lot of concerns that George raised, and also I've got concerns beyond that, even if you go past the points that George raised. That said, in my own mind, I'm trying to understand how we balance, development of a second option within the timeframes. I'm not seeing that as practicable, but I may be wrong. I'm not saying it's practical, but I think, it definitely warrants further discussion. So I'm a little bit concerned you get to an outcome where there is only truly one workable solution at that point in time. But, maybe weeks, maybe months of further discussion may yield something that may be more beneficial, but it's not within the decision-making time period. So I think we need to step back and maybe be pragmatic about how we approach this problem. I'm not so sure it can get done with the timeframes we're talking about, but that doesn't seem, from my perspective, say that it doesn't have merit to discuss what's on the table, or more particularly evolutions of what's on the table.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Point taken, and we'll do our best in the remaining working groups to try to get through it while respecting the other topics that we've already had in the calendar. So I will ask Brian to give us a quick recap, and Brian, if you could just leave me 1 minute at the end to talk through the schedule coming up. Brian?
Yeah, sure. Kevin, I'll do my best. Okay, so today we picked up where we left off on Tuesday. Kevin had kind of summarized where we were on Tuesday with the discussion on the unspecified approach and his characterization of the 4 primary topics to discuss. We continued our discussion on topic number 1 and then got into topic number 2 and maybe a little bit of 4 of settlements. But so we started off talking about the, we finished on Tuesday with the eligibility criteria, and today we got into how it would work in the market. Kevin had characterized his 2 discussion kind of categories as the ask for permission approach and ask for forgiveness approach. And then we had some good discussion on concepts on the path 1 eligibility. There was a discussion that perhaps there was a 3rd option that would be more of a hybrid between the 2. And then I think, as I captured my notes, both Jeff and Mary had kind of commented that it was not their intention in the original presentation that the path 1 and path 2 were mutually exclusive, but really 2 concepts that could be discussed and combined as needed to solve the problem. There was a discussion on what is the nature of the obligations, contractual obligations that would be associated with path 1. And I think it was characterized that, essentially it is any long-term commitment, contractual or otherwise. Then we had a very lengthy discussion on the example of the 70-30% resource. And 3 options were really discussed there. A stacked approach, that didn't get a lot of discussion. It got a comment. And then a pro rata, just a percentage of dispatch approach,
and then a JOU or a division of a resource approach. A lot of discussion there. I noted that Kevin had put in his notes that perhaps Path 1 really is condensed to 100% obligated, committed scenario. I'm not sure if that'll get more discussion, but that was the culmination of that item. On the Path 2 item, there was a discussion on the compatibility of Path 2 with the overall unspecified approach. And I won't get in any details of that debate, but it was a good debate on how it would be within the optimization with respect to the resource specific approach versus unspecified approach and the hurdle rate, et cetera. That was the conversation with George and Jeff. Then we moved on to reporting and compliance. The first discussion topic was, I'm going to leave you a minute here, Kevin, I promise. The first discussion was on, let's see, that the reporting and compliance would be the obligation of the LSEs, but with data coming from Cal ISO. Then there was a pretty lengthy discussion, and I think this is more or less where we ended up on a detailed basis, the discussion on how the day-ahead market and real-time and RUC would interplay with respect to bidding incentives. We then finished up with a conversation about where this unspecified approach is going, that several commented that it is an approach worthy of continued discussion, but others commented that the viability of it needs to be proved for continued evaluation. Back to you, Kevin.
Great, thanks, Brian. All right, folks, so I just want to talk very briefly about the schedule. I will do my best to update it in a timely manner. Tuesday's meeting, we're going to hear from WPTF about a potential new methodology to serve as the baseline for the greenhouse gas attribution in the resource-specific approach. So that'll be the first part of that meeting. And this says we're going to do the evaluation of the unspecified or zonal approach, but I don't think that we're there yet. We have still a remainder of the conversation around reporting and compliance, and then we haven't talked about the hurdle rate questions that I was hoping to raise. So hopefully we'll have a chance to do that on Tuesday, and it might even spill over into Thursday. But that is what the next weeks look like. And want to thank everybody for participating, and let's keep this working group effort going on workshopping this approach so we can get it as detailed as possible. So thanks everybody who provided their input, and thanks Brian and Brenda and Michelle for the help today. Have a good one, everybody.